Okay, thank you, Kristen, for that introduction to the field of online learning and also some of the theoretical underpinnings. Now I'm going to talk about some of the influential controversies that have happened in the field, some improvement trends, and then also some areas of focus in the field. The whole field of online learning itself is a very controversial thing. There are so many controversial issues, as there probably are in any field. It would be hard to delineate all of those, but I chose three particular controversies that I thought were really interesting. One is disruptive technology, another is the for-profit model and issues revolving around that, and then also another controversy is the low completion rates among online students and the reasons for those things. There are really three axiomatic refrains in the field of higher education concerning online education. The first of which that Baudoin points out is that there's an entrenched movement in the field that will likely produce little impactful fruit. And this is a fairly pessimistic viewpoint on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is a fairly positive perspective that emphasizes the benefits of the more flexible nature of online courses and the amount of access that students will have. And then somewhere in between those two viewpoints is the viewpoint that online education has become an acceptable form of higher education, but is yet to prove its salt as a viable means of producing qualified graduates. And so you can see these three kind of axiomatic viewpoints playing out in the different controversies that exist in the field. As mentioned before, disruptive innovation is something that affects business, and it's also trickled down into higher education. According to Clayton Christensen and Matthew Eyring, or Henry Eyring, disruptive innovation in terms of higher education really threatens to overtip the apple cart as far as the traditional academe is concerned. The reason that these are so threatening is because it can be very difficult for traditional faculty to become familiar with all the technological variables that are associated with online learning, especially for those faculty who might not be as technologically savvy. As we all know, online learning offers a variety of mediums that aren't afforded in the traditional classroom, i.e. Asynchronous communication, allowing students to access lecture before actually coming to class, then using the class and instead of as a teacher-centric kind of lecture, it becomes more of a student-centric Q&A, as it were, that allows the instructor and the students to really focus in on problem-solving group work in order to really maximize learning. All of those can be really, really daunting to faculty who really aren't well versed in technological issues. But even for those faculty and students who are, technically adroit, the fact that there is reduced amount of face-to-face interaction can also be fairly daunting. It really shifts the paradigm for those students and those faculty who are really entrenched and very accustomed to that traditional face-to-face medium. And finally, change management can be a really tricky thing for administrators because offering online courses entails a lot more of infrastructure, operational support, logistical support, IT support that is not required to the same extent in a traditional classroom. I think this is analogous, really, the way that online education has disrupted the higher educational realm. It's analogous to big business. There's an interesting example cited by Clark Gilbert et al. In the 2012 article entitled Two Routes to Resilience. And they talked about the responses that Borders and Barnes & Noble both had to Amazon and the Amazon device, the Kindle, where Borders' response was really to maintain the traditional aspect of its company, and in order to do that, they closed stores, they reduced costs, they restructured, to the point where they weren't able to even compete anymore. On the flip side, Barnes & Noble had the really, really innovative response to this disruptive technology or this disruptive innovation, and that was to maintain the traditional arm of the company that people loved, the in-store bookstore experience. But at the same time, while leaning on that traditional arm of the company, they developed this second route, or the second arm of the company, that was an online medium that new customers were really attracted to. And in addition, they created their own device, the Nook, which for many years was a very popular device. But it allowed Barnes & Noble to stay viable as a company, whereas Borders has entirely closed up shop. And so in an analogous way, I think online education is upon us, and our responses can be to maintain the status quo, or to really to develop effective ways of incorporating online learning, and really striving to use the most effective strategies for both implementing online learning, but also teaching and learning considerations as it pertains to online learning. Let's talk about the trouble with for-profits. For-profits kind of represent the veritable black eye of online education that many people point to and say, this is the exemplar of what's wrong with online education. And the reasons are that the tuition is very high for most for-profit online universities, and the student debt is very, very high as well. In a 2014 article, Snyder reported that average tuition fees were about $15,000 a year, and that students' debts averaged about $40,000 at the end of the learning experience. And that didn't even mean that students were graduating. Additionally, Lewin, in a different article, cited that in 2010, the graduation rates were as low as 22%. So this, coupled with low employment, poor outcomes, lending fraud, and basically, as we've seen with the University of Phoenix and other for-profit universities, failing business models and dropping enrollments have caused people to really take umbrage with online education if they're looking solely at the for-profit university model. Now, this isn't to say that all for-profit universities are bad, or that all of them have a similar model. It's not saying that. It's just simply saying that it's a controversial issue that many people don't understand a lot about, but if they're only reading the newspapers, they might be led to believe that the issues with for-profit universities extend to all online education mediums. Lastly, and this relates also to what we talked about with for-profit universities, the low completion rates. This is due to a variety of reasons. Technology can be very tricky for students. And when the technology is tricky, but the technological support from the institution is very low, it can cause a significant decrease in motivation. Another issue early on, and it continues to be an issue, is social presence. Social presence is the sense of feeling through your synchronous and asynchronous communication that there are other people on the other side of the computer that you're interacting with, you're having meaningful conversations with. And if you feel like this is not happening, then it can really cause people to feel isolation. Lack of instructor presence and validation. Sometimes students get the feeling that the instructor is simply some sort of facilitator of the course and nothing more. As they're submitting things asynchronously through discussion boards and things like that, if they're not receiving any sort of interaction from the instructor, they're not feeling any sort of high degree of validation by the instructor. Online education has unintentionally failed to grasp, I think, the issues of low-income and underserved communities. The ironic thing is that they've really attempted to cater to these type of communities, but there's a digital divide that really separates those students who are have a little bit more affluence versus those who are of lesser affluence. And this comes in terms of access to the, ready access to the internet, or access to devices that allow someone to really work effectively on an online course. Other issues that seem to be plaguing especially low-income communities are, in many cases, students from low-income communities are lacking familial support, because often their times are the pioneer in the higher education realm, and so they have no one who, in their own inner circle of family, who understands what it's like to persist through the ups and downs of educational experience. And also, low financial means make it very difficult, especially with high tuition costs. It can cause students to feel highly insecure and engender, a greater propensity to drop out. Current trends towards improvement really revolve around three key maxims. This is number one, improving the quality of the education; two, reducing the cost of the education; and three, expanding the reach of that education to as many demographics as possible. And the motivation for these really stem from the aforementioned technological affordances that we now have, but also attempts to really ease the student financial burdens vis-a-vis the current economic recession and staggering unemployment. So again, in this particular field, there's a lot of trends, but really some interesting trends are the different modes of online delivery that I thought would be interesting to examine. One of those modes is the flipped classroom, competency-based online courses, and then finally MOOCs. The flipped classroom was developed, interestingly, by two high school teachers. They were wanting to provide effective means of helping students who had missed class catch up on the missed lessons. So they made annotated videos to record their lectures, and then they made the videos available online for the students. But they soon found out that students who had not missed class also used the videos to brush up on the content of the lectures. So this gave birth to this flipped classroom, where elements and content typically taught in class were delivered online before class, and then the class became this environment where the instructor could more effectively field questions that students had and work through unclear aspects of the content. And so it's a really interesting idea, and those who really tout flipped classrooms or blended learning really tout that it's able to maximize really the pros of online learning, but also mitigate the cons of online learning, because again, you're blending both the traditional classroom experience, but also with the technological affordances of online learning. Competency-based courses are really interesting. There's a variety of approaches. One approach is a high-stakes test-out option, where students who have learned a particular skill or maybe have advanced knowledge in a particular class can just take a test, and then if they pass the test, then they receive instant credit for the knowledge that they have. Another interesting medium is in competency-based courses is kind of a modular testing approach. And so students might take one test, and then if they do well in certain, according to certain objectives in the class, then they might test out of those modules. But other modules that they might, or other objectives that they might be weak in, then they'll take a series of modules to just brush up on the knowledge that they need, rather than just taking a course which may repeat things that they don't need, and then also offer new knowledge that they don't have. And finally, MOOCs, which are massive open online courses. MOOCs were really built to cater towards a low-income audience or community. They can take on large student populations, the free tuition with open resources, and people really felt like this was the game changer, or kind of the holy grail of equal access and affordability in higher education. And as we know, MOOCs have actually really been controversial. In particular, an interesting case, San Jose State University, EDSI, a company, came together to create this MOOC with the idea in mind that they would be able to really help these underserved low-income communities. But by all accounts, as you can read here, the San Jose experiment was a bust. Completion rates and grades were worse than for those who took traditional campus-style classes. And the students who did best weren't the underserved students San Jose most wanted to reach. Really, the students who did best were students who were most able to do well in these classes because they had better access to the internet. They were highly motivated students. And many of them were students in regular traditional classes rather than people who had no experience previously in higher education. So the key issues in MOOCs and also online course failures, especially among underserved and low-income communities, were access issues that we talked about before. The other issue was that people didn't realize is low-income communities are actually less likely to take college courses, even if the college courses are free, or even if there is federal aid. Another thing, though, that really hampers that is the fact that federal aid restrictions are such that if you're taking part-time school, part-time classes, you don't qualify for things such as Pell Grants, and sometimes you don't qualify for different loans. Another issue is lack of structured support. So historically, any student, but in particular low-income communities or underserved communities, have really felt that lack of structured support, both from kind of technology support, familial support. When those things were lacking, it becomes really easy for them to disengage. And really the issue with many MOOCs is that when time, interest, and maybe even just kind of the necessities of life are compromised, then so are people's abilities to really effectively engage in a MOOC. Some recommendations for improvement. Guan and Stanford recommend financial aid revisions that allow for more flexibility with students who would attempt to go to school online part-time. And more structure and support is really needed at the community college level and also at the big university level for online students. They're finding that there is typically a lot of student and faculty resources available for traditional classes, but in most cases the same level of support is not offered for online students or online faculty. Another thing that Jaggers recommends is more self-regulated learning skill instruction to really help students be persistent, again, through kind of the ups and downs that are inherent in any educational medium, but most especially in online educational medium. And finally, lower tuition rates for online students who are of lower incomes. And finally, lower tuition for online students, despite the fact that online classes tout being a more affordable resource for learning. Tuition is still expensive for people who are of low incomes, but also the textbooks are very, very expensive as well. One interesting movement in the field, especially one cited by Alan Young here, is that there's really a push for more open resources. And it's not just Alan Young that mentioned this, others are pushing for it as well, but the development of open resources that doesn't engender the high costs associated with textbooks. Then finally, let's talk about some areas of focus in the field. A big area of focus is curriculum development. And in many cases, they're finding that online courses are doing just as well with student satisfaction in terms of curriculum development, and even better, traditional online courses. And this is due to the fact that in many cases, online courses take a lot more web-based writing. And that isn't necessarily a skill that the faculty have, but you have a faculty that works as a primary content developer, working in conjunction with a curriculum developer, you really have a nice course set up that really is able to capitalize on the knowledge that the faculty member has, but also the knowledge of curricular development and curricular instruction or instructional development that designer might possess. Another interesting area of focus is socialized learning. You'll see this in a lot, not just in higher education, but you also see this in gamification with learning communities in World of Warcraft and other online games. So socialized learning really promotes this sense of cohort-based learning that really promotes a sense of community and self-efficacy really effectively. Internationalization is actually a really, really interesting development in the field I'm in particular really interested in. From its very beginnings, the distance education field has really been a kind of an international field, especially with those massive distance education universities in England in the early days of the field, where many people from all over the world would, to write in and receive their materials and do their homework and mail it in. And now we're seeing internationalization kind of in this new realm that technology affords. But in order to help these students learn effectively, they've got to learn English, as Maureen Andrade and Alan Young both adroitly pointed out. So English language instruction then becomes a very, very crucial and fundamental element in helping these students to succeed in international realms of online education. as I've pointed out a lot, underserved communities, in many cases, underserved communities have been the impetus for a lot of universities and a lot of people to push online education. But really understanding the variables that lend themselves to helping these students to be more effective, this is a real area of focus, and again, one that I'm particularly interested in myself. And then finally, pedagogical development and support. As I mentioned before, a lot of people coming out of graduate school are ill-prepared for the rigors inherent in teaching online. And so for many of them, the teeth-cutting process happens in kind of a out of the frying pan and into the fire process. And so many of these online instructors are really learning how to fly the airplane that is being an effective online instructor as they're building the airplane itself. And so a lot of universities offer faculty support at varying degrees. Some are very, very good at doing this and really helping faculty to be trained and to feel supported, and others leave a considerable amount wanting. And just as students can feel isolated, online faculty who are remote can feel very, very isolated from their colleagues. I asked one dean how many faculty were in his department meetings, and I asked him facetiously, and he says, well, we have about 13. I said, well, you actually have more faculty than you think you do, because he failed to recognize that he also has these online faculty, but it's kind of an out of mind, out of sight, out of mind type of thing. And so these faculty a lot of times really want professional association with their colleagues at the university, but don't feel that due to the distance and also the isolation that can persist in online education. So this is really an interesting field, and I think one that, as Kristen pointed out, is really in its infancy. It truly is in its infancy, and we're learning a lot, but we're also seeing really the history of this field unfold in rapid ways. And so it's really an exciting time to be a part of this online educational experience. So thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and I look forward to viewing yours and learning from you. Thank you. Bye.